The morning started with a sentence Daniel repeated almost every day: 5 more minutes, then I'll get up. The alarm had already gone off 3 times, but his finger kept finding the snooze button like it had its own nervous system. The room was half dark, the air stale, his head heavy, yet in those first foggy minutes, his brain was especially good at convincing him that 5 minutes would not change anything. 5 minutes quietly turned into 30, and suddenly there was no time for a shower, a proper breakfast, or even calmly packing his bag. The same pattern as always, but every time it felt like a one-off accident. He jumped out of bed with the familiar stab of irritation. I am going to be late again. The bed stayed behind as a crumpled island of chaos in the middle of the room, and Daniel deliberately avoided looking at it, just like he did not look at the pile of clothes on the chair or the mug with yesterday's tea on the windowsill. He pulled on his jeans, found a t-shirt that did not smell too stale yet, and passing the mirror in the hallway, gave his reflection a quick, indifferent glance. His eyes looked dull, his shoulders slightly rounded, but he blamed it on a bad night's sleep and the morning rush, never linking it to the tiny choices that were repeating day after day. In the kitchen, his phone landed in his hand before anything else, as if coffee simply would not brew without it. While the machine hummed and filled the cup, his thumb was already scrolling through news, short clips, and other people's lives, all blending into a single noisy stream with nothing truly important for his own. He dimly remembered that he had only meant to check the time, but 5 minutes later he was still watching strangers' workouts, pets, and vacation highlights. The numbers on the microwave told him he had 10 minutes left before he had to leave, and he still had not eaten or packed. Yet the same voice in his head whispered, "It is fine. You will manage. Just drink your coffee on the way." There had not been a real breakfast in his life for a long time. A piece of bread on the run, a sugary bar from the cupboard, and coffee gulped down too fast had become his standard morning ritual, offering a quick spike of energy and an equally quick crash a couple of hours later. Once he had read that skipping breakfast and relying on sugar mess with focus and weight, but he had shrugged it off, telling himself, that is about other people, not me, I am still young. Now, looking at a soft layer forming around his waist and feeling constant lethargy, he no longer remembered that article. He had simply accepted that he was not a morning person. On the subway to work, crammed among tired faces, he felt oddly reassured. Almost everyone was on their phones, so his own habits felt normal. He pulled out his device intending to answer an important message from a coworker, but his thumb drifted toward a social media icon just for a second. Within moments, he was deep inside a heated comment thread about a viral scandal, reading jokes, hot takes, and angry paragraphs from people he would never meet. When the train reached his station, he looked up with a small shock and realized he had not replied to that work message at all, even though that was the only real reason he had taken the phone out. From the outside, his workday looked perfectly ordinary, but inside it was made of a dozen tiny yeses where he wanted to say no. A colleague asked for just 30 minutes of help with a report, even though Daniel was already behind on his own task, and he smiled and agreed because saying no felt rude. Another coworker stopped by with a quick favor. Could he write a few lines for their presentation? And again he heard himself say, "Sure, no problem," while a quiet knot tightened in his chest. Each time he agreed, he felt a small inner protest, but he drowned it in jokes. I am the helpful guy, I will figure it out somehow. By lunchtime, his brain felt like cotton and his eyes burned from the screen. He had planned to walk to a cafe a few blocks away to stretch his legs, but he ended up ordering delivery and staying glued to the chair, staring at the monitor while he waited. The meal arrived heavy, salty, and washed down with soda. Not because he truly wanted it, but because it was familiar and solved the problem fast. 40 minutes later, he was yawning, his stomach uncomfortably full, but he once again blamed a complicated project instead of his own energy-draining choices. All afternoon, he bounced between tasks without finishing any of them. He checked email, then opened news, then replied to a personal message, then skimmed a forum. Each switch seemed to cost only seconds, yet by evening they had silently turned into hours. When his manager asked why the report still was not ready, Daniel could not clearly explain where the time had gone because he truly had not spent it doing nothing. Deep inside, an uncomfortable thought flickered. Maybe the distractions were not chasing him, maybe he was chasing them. That evening at home, he again walked past the unmade bed and the leaning tower of clothes on the chair, telling himself he would deal with everything later. Plates piled in the sink for tomorrow because he felt too exhausted after such a hard day. Even though objectively 5 minutes of washing would have been enough, he turned on a series in the background just to rest his mind and somehow ended up watching 3 full episodes. By the time the credits rolled, he no longer remembered the opening scene, but he knew for sure that none of the important personal tasks he had planned for the evening had even been started. Going to bed early was ruined by the same small rectangle of light. He scrolled through posts and short videos until his eyes physically hurt and his brain felt numb from the flood of information. Every time he whispered, "This is the last one," the algorithm served another clip, slightly funnier, slightly angrier, slightly more gripping than the previous. Past midnight, the phone finally slipped from his hand onto the pillow, and already half asleep, he muttered the sentence that had lost all meaning: "Tomorrow, I will start living differently." Only tomorrow would look almost exactly the same because Daniel still had no idea that his life was not being ruined by big dramatic decisions, but by these quiet invisible gestures he did not even recognize as habits. They hid behind harmless phrases like 5 more minutes, I will just check for a second, today I will just order in, and okay, I will help, it is no big deal. Stealing another slice of time, health, and self respect each day. From the outside, he was just an ordinary, slightly tired guy in a crowded city. But inside, a slow collapse had already started, silent enough that he could pretend nothing serious was wrong. And as long as his life felt just a bit worse than it could be, the most dangerous habits would keep working in the background, patient, unnoticed, and incredibly efficient. A few months later, Daniel realized that his days were blurring into one long, sticky strand of sameness. Every morning began the same way: oversleeping, rushing, skipping a real breakfast, and that familiar thin layer of guilt he covered with jokes and fast content on his screen. The phrase, "I will handle it later," had become his universal key to any discomfort. From dirty dishes to strange letters from the bank that he sometimes did not even bother opening, the world around him seemed to be moving forward while he circled the same block, writing it off as a rough patch rather than a predictable result of his routine. One lunch break, he stepped out to buy coffee and caught his full reflection in a shop window. Slouched shoulders, dark circles under his eyes, a shirt that looked like it had lost the battle with the chair pile. He used to laugh at articles claiming posture could affect mood and confidence, but now, looking at the tired stranger in the glass, he felt an unexpected wave of embarrassment. Automatically, he straightened his back, pulled in his stomach, lifted his chin, and for a second he saw a different version of himself, sharper and more alive. A few steps later, though, his body slid back into its usual curve, and the thought that followed was as predictable as ever. I will start working out soon, just not this week. At work, consequences stopped being vague. Because of constant context switching and procrastination, deadlines began slipping, tasks piled up, and his manager called him in more often for a quick talk. Daniel always came armed with reasonable explanations: an urgent request from a colleague, a technical glitch, an unusually heavy workload, but none of those stories included the hours lost in endless scrolling and people pleasing. Deep down, he suspected that the real problem lived on his screen and in his inability to say no. Yet, admitting that would mean facing his own responsibility, and that felt too raw. His health became the clearest scoreboard for all those small laters. Chronic sleep debt turned into his default setting. Going to bed after midnight and fighting the alarm in the morning felt like proof that he was hustling, not that he was quietly exhausting himself. He noticed his heart beating faster on some mornings, a slight tremor in his hands when he poured coffee, and a constant mental fog that forced him to reread the same email twice. When friends invited him for a run in the park, he refused, with a vague line about a deadline. But what truly scared him was the thought of discovering how unfit he had become. Money, once a neutral topic, started to sting as well. He had always considered himself okay with finances. His salary covered rent, food, and an occasional trip, and that felt enough. But the invisible daily leaks, takeout instead of cooking, extra subscriptions he never used, little impulse buys because I deserve a treat, slowly drained the savings he had once been proud of. When his laptop suddenly died, he opened his banking app and realized there was no real emergency fund left, only a credit card limit that now looked less like freedom and more like a trap. That evening, sitting on his unmade bed with the dead laptop beside him, Daniel finally opened one of those bank emails he usually ignored. The message politely reminded him that his balance had hovered near zero for several months and suggested simple budgeting steps he could follow. He stared at the screen, feeling a mix of shame and annoyance, and then closed the email without saving any of the advice, telling himself he would deal with finances later when things calmed down. The absurd part was that he genuinely believed there would be some magical calmer season ahead, even though nothing in his habits pointed in that direction. Socially, the pattern repeated itself in softer ways. He answered messages hours or days late, not because he was busy, but because he kept waiting for the right moment to respond properly instead of sending a quick line now. He agreed to plans he did not want and then cancelled at the last minute, inventing excuses that hurt his own trust in his word a little more each time. Friends still liked him, but slowly they stopped inviting him to spontaneous things, assuming he was always tired or unavailable. The most painful cost of later, however, was invisible even to him. For years, Daniel had wanted to start a small side project, a simple channel where he could tell stories and share ideas about everyday life, nothing grand. He had a notebook full of concepts, structural notes, even half finished scripts. But every time he came close to starting, he told himself he needed a long, clean weekend to do it properly. Those perfect weekends never appeared, swallowed by errands, vague fatigue, and mindless scrolling, and the unwritten stories weighed on him like quiet ghosts. Sometimes, late at night, he would imagine an alternate version of his life where he had simply started, messy and imperfect, 6 months ago. In that version, there were a few awkward early attempts, some mild embarrassment, and then slow, noticeable progress. Nothing miraculous, just honest movement. In his real life, there were none of those first tries, only research, planning, and endless mental rehearsals that left him emotionally tired and practically unchanged. The gap between the life he pictured and the one he actually lived grew wider, one postponed action at a time. Yet, because each delay was tiny, he could always pretend the distance was not his fault. By now, Daniel's days were no worse than many people's, and that was the dangerous part. There was no big catastrophe, no dramatic rock bottom, only a slow rise in background stress, a quiet erosion of health, and a steady flattening of his hopes. If anyone had asked, he would have described himself as just tired and a bit unlucky lately, never suspecting that his life was carefully shaped by his smallest, laziest choices. And somewhere between another snoozed alarm, another ignored email, and another evening lost to his screen, the bill for every later continued to grow, line by invisible line. The turning point did not arrive as a lightning bolt. It crept in as another ordinary morning that simply hurt more than usual. Daniel woke to the familiar alarm, hit snooze by reflex, and then, for some reason, stayed awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. His chest felt tight, his mind heavy, and for the first time, the thought came fully formed. If every day feels like this, maybe the problem is not the day. Instead of drifting back to shallow sleep, he lay there, tracing the previous 24 hours in his mind, detail by detail. He remembered the extra episode he had watched, the messages he had not answered, the pointless online argument that had eaten his lunch break. He replayed the moment he had snapped at a coworker for distracting him, even though he had spent more time distracting himself. He saw the pile of dishes, the unmade bed, the unopened bank notifications sitting in the corner of his screen like a blinking warning light. For the first time, it all looked less like bad luck and more like a system he had built gesture by gesture. The realization scared him, but it also gave him something he had not felt in months, a small sense of agency. If tiny habits had quietly broken his days, maybe tiny habits could start repairing them. The idea sounded almost too simple, the kind of thing he usually mocked in self-help videos. Yet now simplicity felt like the only thing he had enough strength for. He decided not to change his life, but to experiment with one invisible gesture at a time. The first target was the morning snooze ritual. He moved his phone to the opposite side of the room so that turning off the alarm would force him to stand up. The next day, when the sound blared, his body, still heavy and grumpy, had to cross the cold floor, and something subtle shifted. He was already on his feet. He still wanted to crawl back into bed, but he told himself he only had to stay up long enough to open the curtains and drink a glass of water. That glass of water became his second invisible gesture. It took less than a minute, but it marked a clean line between sleep and wakefulness, a tiny act of care for a body he had treated like a replaceable machine. He did not feel instantly energized, yet his mind felt a fraction clearer, clear enough to toast a slice of bread instead of grabbing candy on the way out. It was not a perfect breakfast, but it was a step away from the sugar crash cycle he had normalized. Next, he went after the endless morning scroll. He allowed himself to check messages only after he was dressed and had eaten something, using that small rule as a shield against reflexive thumb swipes. The first few days were rough. His fingers almost itched for the short, bright hits of entertainment, and he caught himself staring at the blank wall as if it should be moving. But in that silence, he also heard thoughts he had been drowning out, worries, desires, half-forgotten ideas that had been waiting for room to breathe. At work, he experimented with tiny boundaries. When a colleague asked for help, he paused for 3 seconds before answering, long enough to check his own workload instead of reflexively saying yes. Sometimes he still agreed, but now he framed it. I can give you 15 minutes now, but then I have to get back to my report. That small sentence felt awkward in his mouth at first, but each time he used it, the knot in his chest loosened just a little. He also tried a simple rule for his screen time at the office, one tab at a time. If he worked on a report, he closed everything else. If he answered emails, he did only that for 10 or 15 minutes. The change was not magical. He still drifted off sometimes, but instead of losing hours without noticing, he caught himself after a few minutes and steered back. By the end of the week, he finished one piece of work earlier than expected, and the small win felt strangely huge. Evenings were the hardest battlefield because they were built from pure exhaustion. Instead of promising himself a perfect routine, he picked one anchor habit: washing the dishes before opening any streaming app. It took 5 to 10 minutes on most days, but it transformed the way his home felt. Walking into a clean kitchen in the morning gave him a quiet, almost private sense of pride. Sometimes, after finishing the dishes, he realized he was less desperate for escape and more open to doing one small productive thing. That one thing became the doorway back to his abandoned project. He gave himself a laughably small target: 5 minutes a day to touch anything related to his stories. Reread an old idea, adjust a sentence, brainstorm a title. Most nights, once he started, 5 minutes stretched into 15 or 20. not because of discipline, but because it finally felt good to move, even at a crawl. Within a month, he had a rough outline for his first episode, something that had not existed in all those previous months of thinking about it. The outside world did not suddenly change. His salary was the same, his manager was still demanding, the city still noisy, and his phone still full of temptations. What shifted was the ratio of invisible gestures. A few that once dragged him down were now quietly pulling him up. He began to understand that habits were not moral judgments, but tiny votes, cast all day long for the person he was becoming. One night, scrolling through old photos, he found a picture of himself from a year before. Slightly slimmer, maybe, but with the same tired eyes. For the first time, he did not wince or feel ashamed. Instead, he felt a strange compassion for that version of himself who had no idea how much his smallest choices mattered. He realized that even now, nothing about his transformation was dramatic enough for a movie. There was no heroic montage, just a different way of living the same ordinary days. But ordinary days were exactly where his life actually happened, and if that was true, then changing the tiny boring gestures inside them was not boring at all. It was the only kind of magic that lasted.